This is David Barstow on Democracy Now! In May of 2009, explaining how Pentagon officials developed this program during the lead-up to the Iraq War.
The way to really influence the American public was to try to find people who were viewed as independent of both government and the media, people who were considered authoritative and expert, people who would have an ability to cut through the spin. And the group that they began zeroing in on were all the military analysts who were being hired in droves after 9/11 by all the major TV networks. In the view of Tori Clark and her staff, these guys were sort of the ultimate key influencers. They were seen as, most of them, retired decorated war heroes. There were many of them retired generals, some 3- and 4-star generals. They came from an institution that traditionally is extremely trusted by the American public. And they were seen by the public not really as of the media, but not of the government either. And so in the fall of 2002, Tori Clark and her aides, and with the strong support from the White House and from her bosses, set out to target this group and to make them really one of the main vehicles for reaching the American public and building support from the war on terror. And so that's how it sort of began, was with this idea that they could take this thing called the military analysts, which is a creature that's been around for a long time, going back to the first Gulf War. We remember some of the retired generals first coming on air. And they could take this and the fact of 9/11 and the fact of how prevalent they were on air, sometimes appearing, segment after segment after segment, getting more airtime than many correspondents were getting, holding forth, not just on the issues of, where the airplanes are flying and where the tanks are moving, but weighing, more heavily on even the strategic issues of what should we do next and how should the war on terror unfold, what should be the next targets. And they looked at them as effectively what they were doing was writing the op-ed on air for the networks and for the cables. And they noticed the way the relationships between the anchors and their sort of in-house generals, there was a sort of bond between anchor and general, and you didn't see the kind of challenging questioning that would go on if you had sent, for example, a representative of the Pentagon to the TV station. It was a much more almost fawning in some cases, a kind of relationship between anchor and general. So they saw this group, and they saw in this group a way of taking the media filter, which politicians are always so fond of complaining about, and turning the media filter into more of a media megaphone.
That's the Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times reporter David Barstow and his expose last year. Bryan Bender, you're the national security reporter for the Boston Globe. Your final comment on this, as you talk about the generals who become military contractors. In the media, they are rarely identified as such, simply as a retired general, even when they're pushing for some weapon system that their corporation will benefit from.
Well, I think David's segment gets to this point of real angst that is growing within the military, and that is that the retired generals are sort of the moral exemplars of all the people coming up the ranks behind them. And if there is even the appearance of this conflict of interest, an appearance that they're doing something behind the scenes that they don't want public, they don't want disclosed, that has repercussions for the military. And there's not a whole lot of voices in the military that are saying that publicly just yet. There certainly are some retired generals who've told me about it. And again, I think it gets to the broader issue of what this trend means to the health of the officer corps. If everyone sees this conveyor belt that goes from the Pentagon to the private defense world, and a lot of it is not very public and it's not very transparent, The big question that some of them have is, does this erode what traditionally it's meant to be an officer in the United States?
Bryan Bender, I want to thank you for being with us. We'll link to your piece at the Boston Globe, and that does it for our broadcast. Renowned physician and human rights activist Dr. Binayak Sen has been sentenced to life in prison in India. Amnesty International calls him a prisoner of conscience. We'll post our interview with him at democracynow.org. Don't miss it. Thanks to the whole staff who came in today. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for joining us.